Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RCNerd74. In today's video I will do a first function check of all the electronics I will install on the plane. I will show you all the details about the cowling mount and also the build of the rudder fin. For those who follow me on Instagram too, they perhaps already saw that I also made a lot of small carbon parts for the cowling and the fuselage, but there was so much going on in the progress, so I will do two videos, the separate video with all the carbon progress. So in today's video it's all about electronics and the cowling mount and the rudder fin. So let's jump right into the steps and have a closer look to all the details. The electronics check I just did to make sure that all the electronics will work. The plan was to use all the stock electronics except the receiver, because I don't use a Spectrum system but Futaba, so I had to switch from the stock receiver to the 8-channel Futaba receiver. Another reason for the switch is also that I won't use a 6-channel receiver but an 8-channel receiver, just because I want to connect every single servo to a separate channel. Like this you can program your plane way easier, way cleaner than if you use the epsilon cables for flaps and ailerons, which make the programming pretty tricky, and you have to do some adjustments on the servo rods. If you want to have a really clean installation and programming, I recommend to use a separate channel for every single servo. When I was testing the ESC, I figured out that you cannot program the throttle range of your transmitter on the ESC, so you have throttled too early on a position about 80% on the stick. You have already full throttle, and also if you decrease the throttle, the behavior of the ESC is not the same as when you increase the throttle. So looks like the ESC is pretty cheap, and I already decided to use a Hobbywing 60 amp ESC, which has stronger back and which has perfectly proportional linear throttle, and you can also easily program the throttle range, so you have perfect full throttle at full stick position, and the behavior of the ESC is way smoother than the stock ESC. On the stock ESC, I first wanted to remove the on-off switch, because I simply don't like on-off switches. In my opinion, it's an unnecessary risk of some mechanical stuff which can break, and if the switch breaks during the flight, you will 100% crash. So I wanted to remove the switch from the stock ESC, and I figured out that you cannot do this. If you remove the switch, you are no more able to arm the ESC. If you connect the battery to the ESC and have no more switch, just soldered the two cables together, which regularly connected to the switch, the ESC won't arm. If you use the stock ESC, you really have to use also the on-off switch, otherwise the ESC won't work. A thing I figured out on the stock motor is that the bearings are pretty noisy. Doesn't look like a big deal, but looks like the motor is also on the cheap side, so perhaps I will change the motor after some test flights. We will see, but for the first flights I will use the stock motor, and if I'm happy with the performance, I think I will keep it. Then I also did a short light system check, if the light system, which is switchable from the transmitter, works as it should. Everything looked good so far. I'm pretty happy how easy the installation of the electronics was. All the detail work for programming and servo setup will follow later on the build. To make the Hobbywing ESC work on my RC Scrappy, I had to reprogram it, because before RC Scrappy I used it in a 3D helicopter so I had to change from helicopter throttle mode to wing throttle mode. So I had to use the programming card and set the programming to wing mode so everything will fit for RC Scrappy. Before I started to build the mount for the cowling, I wanted to make sure that the extended motor mount and the custom 3-blade prop won't make any problems in case of vibrations. So I balanced the 3-blade prop with my Dubro balancer, which works absolutely perfect also for 3-blade props. So I did the first spin up with the 3-blade prop just to see if there's any issues with the modification on the motor mount and on the balance prop. But everything looked good so far, and I think I can use my installation like I did it so far. Then I started to go for the mount of the cowling. First of all, I removed some foam on the front end of the fuselage, which is not needed for the modified cowling. This is just weight, so I cut off some foam down to the plastic parts from the stock motor mount. Like this, I do not affect the strength of the motor mount, but I simply can remove a little bit of weight and also a little better access to the modified motor mount. To make sure that the cowling will sit in the perfect position, also well centered on the spinner, because the cowling has the exact same front end shape and diameter like the spinner. I had to make sure that the spinner and the front end of the cowling will be aligned perfectly. For this, I glued on some 0.8 mm shims onto the front end of the cowling to make the space which I need between the cowling and the spinner. Then I glued on the back plate of the spinner. I used UHU Por to glue on all this stuff just because UHU Por is pretty easy to remove later. So there will be no remains from UHU Por after cleaning the parts when I have the installation of the cowling done. Next step was to mark the edges of the cowling on the fuselage. This helped me to find the exact right position for the wooden parts I glued into the fuselage to screw on the cowling. Then I drawed the exact position where I had to mill the holes into the cowling to glue in the wooden parts. Then milled out all the holes, and during milling I messed up milling one hole, so the Dremel freaked out in the foam and damaged some parts of the fuselage. So I had to repair the thing. For this I made a nice shape of the hole, took a part of the foam, I cut it away from the fuselage, made it fit into the hole, glued it in with epoxy, sanded it down to a flat surface, and had to remill this damaged hole to make all the 10 mount points of the cowling look clean and perfect. Then I had to draw the center lines of all the wooden mounts on the fuselage, so I was able to transfer the center line onto the cowling. Like this, I figured out the exact position for all the drilling holes, because I had to drill the holes through the canopy into the wood. So like this, it's absolutely sure that the cowling will sit in the right position. Then I wrote the distance from the edge of the cowling to the center of every single wooden mount onto the wooden mount. The reason for slightly different distances is that it's all handmade and it's not perfectly 100% identical distance. It's about 1 or 1.5 millimeter difference from the edge to the screw, but I think this won't be a big deal. I also wrote the numbers just right onto the wooden mounts. Like this, I was able to measure the distance from the edge of the cowling and mark the exact center of the drill hole on the cowling. Then it was time to put on the cowling, fixed it with some tape that it perfectly stays in place during drilling. then drilled all the 10 holes for the screws. These were 1.5mm holes. The screws are 1.7mm diameter. So like this, it was perfect fit of the screws into the wooden mounts. After screwing all the screws, it was time to remove the back plate of the spinner from the cowling and check if the cowling really stays in the exact right position I need to make it perfectly aligned with the spinner. And I would say it's 99% okay, not absolutely perfect, but I will do some work on the front end of the cowling to make it look absolutely perfect with the final result after all the paint job I have to do on the cowling. There is one step I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video. What I also changed is the shape of the sides of the fuselage. They are slightly too flat, so full-scale Scrappy has slightly rounded sides of the fuselage, and I tried to put the same shape on the foam fuselage of my Carbon Cub. For this I marked some new shape lines with tape on the tail of the fuselage and sanded both sides down to this new width, and also rounded a little bit the edges so the edges are a little bit stronger against pressure, and I think it also looks a little nicer when the edges are a little bit rounded. For sanding down the fuselage I used 240 sandpaper. This works absolutely great to do slight corrections on the fuselage. You won't damage the foam and you get a really clean surface with using 240 sandpaper. Then it was time to make the rudder fin. Full-scale Scrappy has an extended rudder, which is a big fin on the front end of the stock rudder. I want to come as close as possible to full-scale Scrappy's look, so I decided to make this fin too. I used as a core XPS foam, had to cut out the shape, sand it down to a narrow shape, then wrapped it with carbon fiber, used 4 layers of epoxy, sanded every single layer down, wet sanded the last layer of epoxy to get a really nice surface. To work on the fin, I used a small toothpick mount which helped me to wrap the carbon fiber over the fin, over the foam core. Like this it was easier to work on the fin. Then finally, to glue it on, I used 10-minute epoxy. This makes the fin really sit strong on the fuselage and will take all the forces which will come during the flight. This is it for today's video. On the next episode I will talk about all the progress I did on all the carbon stuff. What you can see laying around here, these are all the carbon parts which I will add on to the cowling and also to the fuselage, a lot of air intakes and air outlets. But this is it for today's video. I hope you like it. Thanks for watching. Have a good time. See you in the next one. Bye bye.